Ultra Nothing is a thing of pure artistic malice. Built out of discordant sounds and clashing colours, digital artifacting and obfuscated instruction, you have to figure things out, and often one of the things you have to figure out is whether you can even figure it out. Some of the stuff going on in this game is utterly baffling, and playing it feels like you're living inside a migraine, and yet there is something about it. A kernel of intrigue that kept me playing. Ultra Nothing is a fascinating take on the Sokoban genre. Puzzles come in the form of a sequence of actions and reactions. Blocks to push, ledges to climb, floors that may or may not collapse after being stepped on. Some levels are relatively straightforward, others require a lot of mental taxation. Sometimes the challenge is just attempting to pass the visual language on screen in order to know where to go next. I don't think it all works. I think maybe if you're presenting text in a game, that text should be readable without having to squint. I also think it would really benefit from having a move undo button rather than just a turbo nuke that starts you from scratch. That being said, I had a lot of fun tearing what little hair I have left out trying to make sense of its baffling ideas and esoteric presentation of core concepts. And not to spoil things too much, but I've just reached a bit where the game has opened up considerably and unlocked an entirely new set of mechanics. There's a panic-inducing amount of game here. I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. For the cost of entry, this is a brilliantly unusual gift, and the perfect game to kick off this second volume of unusual oddities that won't break your budget. Within the inharmonious soundscape, the visceral art style, and frankly baffling plot, Hylics is a game that is surprisingly user-friendly. A pint-sized RPG adventure in the vein of the 8 and 16-bit classics, you navigate a strange world with a strange party, doing strange things in combat, and inevitably facing off against strange foes. It's all just really strange. But it's not an astringent experience, oh no. What we have here on a mechanical level is something quite straightforward. Some fights are tough, but all of them are manageable, and the world is small enough that with very little buggering about, you can figure out what you need in order to make it past each roadblock. There's a quite satisfying rhythm to the gameplay loop. As you explore and uncover new pieces of equipment and abilities, the draw to return to previous areas to mop up outstanding fights and unventured pastures inevitably rewards that persistence, and death only halts progress, it never sets you back. Hylics has its moments, for sure. The upgrade system exists on this all-or-nothing spectrum where if you use the resources required for increasing health and magic too soon, later party members miss out on the boost. There's also a number of instant death maze puzzles that really go up against the jank of the game world. Getting caught on the scenery for the dozenth time to be insta-gibbed by some hellish creation will only make you wish a painful death upon its creator. That is, of course, hyperbole. Mason Lindroth, I wish you nothing but a long and healthy life. All in all, a pretty great experience. I rinsed this in 2 settings. It won't set you back more than about 4 hours, and then if you really like it, there's a bigger and more ambitious sequel already out for not that much more money. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet and accept that you were wrong about something. I've known about One Night Stand for years. It's one of the pillars of the solo developer indie sphere, something so quietly paramount to the history of games that it feels embarrassing to admit why it was that I hadn't played it until now. I never found myself all that interested at the time because, in my head, the central conceit was something I just could not relate to. Obviously, years down the line I now realise what an idiotic sentiment this is, one I've never shared when it comes to, say, running a farm or slaying a dragon. Also, extra stupid because I actually do have some lived experience of the central scenario, although not to the extreme presented within. That reluctance to engage with the game definitely feels like a huge error on my part now that I've finally played One Night Stand and discovered, rather unsurprisingly, that it's really bloody good. Lucy Blundell has made a game that revels in a series of concentric narrative circles that all pool around this single problem. You've woken up in a stranger's bed and you have no idea how you ended up there. It's sort of like the prototype for Disco Elysium if you think really hard about it, a framework you build upon to construct your own version of the narrative. This is quite a short game, but it's designed to be played multiple times, and I think it's important that you do this, because it's how you unfurl a lot of the smaller details that make you appreciate what a special game this is. The way animations are used frugally but to maximize emotional impact, the fact that this is a story written from a female perspective but using a male protagonist, the idea that waking up in media res does not bind you to a particular moral pathway. It all makes for a deeply personal experience for both the creator and the player. Half a fiver, this one. You'd be stupid not to. 2048 with jiggle physics is a wild concept to come up with, but somehow it's led to an experience that is far greater than the sum of its parts. Suika Jelly Game is an arcadey experience that I simply could not stop playing. I wanted to chase those higher and higher scores. I wanted to see what would happen the more fruit I combined, how I would make sense of the game space when things started to get a bit ripe. The thing about this is that while it's ostensibly built off the foundation of that classic sliding block puzzler, in execution it feels like a very different experience. The rules become innate after only a few minutes. 2 blueberries make a strawberry, 2 strawberries make a kiwi, and so forth. As you go up the fruit chain, those combined items get bigger and bigger, but the jar in which you are storing all of these goodies remains the same. As you build your fruit empire, you also build up a meter that, once full, allows you to put a lid on things and shake up your order. This is a sort of crowd control thing, allowing you to reach smaller fruits stuck behind bigger ones, but it has within it a risk of a game over, because the more you shake, the more likely you'll get a wayward cantaloupe trying to make its escape. Anything that passes that threshold triggers the end of the run. There's this interesting balance in how you approach your goals. Knowing that there is a finiteness to your ability to keep going, score chasing is less about building up these larger and larger fruits and more about using those larger pieces as a means of controlling the rate at which your total volume of fruit is managed. It's an enormously fun game for such a modest price, one of those things I think you would be daft not to give a go. Landing on a hostile planet by your own choosing. Laser pistol in hand, an army of guards ready to take you to task, an insurmountable debt hanging over you like the world's most rotten carrot. You have 30 minutes. Make it count. Under a Star Long Cold is an unbelievably cool premise for a game. Another entry in Antonio Freya's collection of frictional, esoteric stealth sims. You start each run in a different location on this hostile planet, and you have one goal: grab as much swag as you can before the whole thing is disintegrated. 50,000 is the goal. This isn't going to be an easy bounty to accrue, and that's where a lot of the game's most interesting design comes from. Under a Star Long Cold takes on this sort of Outer Wilds mentality, in that you have to figure out what your approach to the task at hand will be off the back of a dozen or so futile attempts, building up from which a vast bank of knowledge about the cost-benefit ratio of targeting certain buildings over others, knowing where the best loot is, and even working out a path to avoid all the most dangerous obstacles. What helps with all this is that the game's visual direction is incredibly instructive. The planet is littered with these really striking landmarks that allow you to navigate with ease. Once you get a feel for where things are in this condemned wasteland of an astral body, it's off to the races. Figuratively, I mean, you don't want to rush, you'll end up in an early grave. Frictional design is the name of the game. From the visuals, to the expansive play space that at times feels a little bit too big, to the stiffness and inconsistency of the control scheme, everything feels built for a reason. Shooting is a fool's errand because you're not supposed to be doing it. Enemies will kill you with swift and clinical precision because you are not supposed to be there. It doesn't alleviate some of the frustration I had playing this game, but I do respect why it has to be this way. At first it feels impossible to achieve that win condition with everything against your favour, but then again, the central thesis is this sense of being fucked from the get-go. You even have to click lose hope to start the game. That's a hell of a vibe. It's chess! Except it isn't. Not really. The rules are all messed up. Your opponent keeps calling you out for cheating. Your opponent most definitely is cheating themselves, but you don't know enough about the rules to call them out on it. You will lose a lot. But don't worry, because this is that brash, celebratory kind of loss. Instructive as much as it is destructive. The game, as it turns out, isn't really chess at all, but rather this process of figuring out what the rules of this unhinged goblin version of that classic strategy game actually are. You're not alone. Armed with an obscure tome, the more you play, the more the rules of the game are revealed to you, offering over time a reference point for the actions taken by yourself and your wily rival. Correctly call out their bad behaviour and you get a chance to pull off a cheeky manoeuvre of your own. However, the act of spotting this sneak behaviour still falls on you. To win a game of King of the Bridge, you need to be sharp-eyed and quick-witted, neither of which are traits I possess. There's something beautifully organic about how this game has been designed. In many ways it feels like a true reflection of the way analog experiences can be altered and abused. Normally in digital games the mechanics are so rigid that it's only through sheer force of will that players can skirt the boundaries of logic and break the game wide open. Here it's not only welcomed, it's the key to victory. A fascinating experience. I'd love to see this approach more in games, where subterfuge and deception are the road to glory. This feels like it's in conversation with other experiences like Inscription and Chaos, where knowing the rules is only half the battle, and gut instinct reigns supreme. I've been playing a fair number of games set underwater recently. Below the Ocean is perhaps the least terrifying, but also the most mechanically complex. A really engaging physics and momentum-based puzzle platformer that feels like a mix of Celeste and Shinsekai Into the Depths. It's a game about balancing flexibility with a need for precious oxygen, a series of bespoke puzzle rooms, each utilising some aspect of the core mechanics to navigate and survive. You attach yourself to a range of oxygen cylinders littered throughout, with your air hose acting as a source of life, a tether, and a sort of navigation tool, the use of which allows you to reach areas you normally wouldn't be able to with a simple jump. That momentum is incredibly tactile and feels great to get to grips with, and its use for other means in later challenges is nothing short of inspired. Sometimes there are enemies, but they rarely seek you out themselves, acting as little more than moving obstacles to consider during your trials. Death is a possibility, but restarts are plentiful and checkpoints even more so. It's very generous in what it offers you to keep you going. Much like Celeste, it also features additional challenges off the beaten path, some of which are surprisingly fiendish. The game never quite gets to the stage of bastard hard that made that other celebrated platformer so iconic, but I was surprised at just how engaging and fun the whole experience was. Each chapter adds new wrinkles to the formula, compounding and adding to the overall design in a way that feels like this is the perfect version of this idea straight out the gate. It's a really excellent little thing, more than worth your time and money, and it doesn't demand too much of either. Alright, how do I even begin to explain this one? An episodic narrative adventure, beautifully realised with this scrappy art style, absolutely balmy in its content. Anthology of The Killer was first brought to my attention by a wayward tweet from a stranger dragged onto my timeline, espousing its virtues, citing it as some of the best video game writing since Disco Elysium. The result of which was that it was a game that I kept in my rear view as I worked my way through last year's obnoxious backlog project, knowing that at some point I would get to it. Following its official Steam release last year and a further barrage of praise from a number of critics whose opinions echo my own, I had no choice but to submit and acknowledge that yes, this game really is that good, but it's something that has to sit with you in order to gestate that particular brilliance. In terms of form or function, what's presented to you is relatively straightforward. forward, a hub world in the form of a first-person museum where each of the 10 episodes are presented as exhibits to engage with. Each episode is dedicated to a particular theme and tone, dripping in baffling imagery, but with a particular idea at its core. It tackles a lot in such a short space of time. The freedom of creativity, the dark heart of urban mythology, politics, emotions, a general scraping ennui that festers in the background of every diorama. I think this is something it's hard to sell to someone without a frame of reference, and certainly there are aspects of the experience that are flying completely over my head. It feels evocative of titles like Kentucky Route Zero in that sense. You have the game, but then you have the multiple lifetimes of experiences of other mediums that help to bring this thing to life. In the case of Anthology of the Killer, rather generously, there is plenty to engage with regardless of what each player brings into the equation. The core experience of the game is really bloody entertaining. Smart, funny, tense as hell in places due to how often you get chased. It feels like one of the truly unsung heroes of the contemporary era. I cannot recommend it enough. I am endlessly impressed with the way in which visual novels use the systems they are built for to create unusual mechanisms for delivering what is essentially just prose. It's a difficult balance to get right when your primary means of interaction is so static in practice, a simple button press to reveal the next line of text. There's a wealth of creativity to be found within this genre, however, and I found in this fascinating detective game another piece of that puzzle. No Case Should Remain Unsolved utilizes the genre of its fiction, a missing persons cold case with a lot of questions left unanswered, to create a narrative jigsaw that feels like the intersection of her story and The Room. Under the guise of fragmented memory, you trawl through interviews with a group of people to piece together a timeline and an identification of the key players in this unfurling tragedy. Text is presented, rather unusually, in columns, with your primary means of interaction being arranging and swapping blocks of information up and down the timeline, and between different characters. Connections made unlock further questions to be answered, with the ultimate goal simply to understand what's actually going on. What makes it interesting is that a lot of the information you need to glean is built from implication, not inference. Tone and speculation used as tools for understanding just how many stories are playing concurrently, and through that ambiguity, some very clever red herrings are placed. Not knowing all the names of the players at hand at first adds to the initial confusion, but because of that, there is a sublime joy to be found in finally clocking who said what and when. To say any more would be to spoil the surprise of what is not only an incredibly engaging puzzle box, but also a brilliantly evocative and surprisingly poignant piece of fiction. Get it played. There's something so relaxing about fishing, chilling by the water's edge, waiting for whatever deigns to take a nibble of your lure. It's one of those rare pleasures where failure is the desired effect. The moment you ensnare some wayward creature, that's when the work starts. Fishing in games, however, is a mostly stressful endeavour, one that often requires a keen eye and a deft hand. Us gamers are impatient buggers, aren't we? There's no joy to be found in doing nothing, so the alternative is bashing our heads against the challenge of doing something. With Mysteries Under Lake Ophelia, although doing something is very much the goal of the game, I never found myself all that bothered about progression. It's an elegiac experience, set in a space that just feels very nice to tootle about in, even though there is little of interest to be found on the surface. Fishing is the primary means of engagement. You have a book to fill and increasingly eerie depths to explore. This is how progression is tied in. You sell your catches to afford upgrades that allow you to cast further and dive deeper. The further down you go, the more alien your catch becomes, with something truly unknown lying at the deepest cavity of this liminal space. The clear and stated evocation of Ocarina of Time's more unusual vibes stand on their own here. Developer Bryce Boucher has captured perfectly the exact tone and feeling of that ambitious N64 title in both art direction and soundscape, as well as that leap of shock whenever you discover something unusual in that world. This game has Hylian loaches everywhere for those with eyes to see. I found myself utterly engrossed in this thing, spending hours casting a line and drinking in the atmosphere. Will I get to the mystery at the center of this arcane space? Who knows? But it's about the journey, not the destination, and honestly, the destination looks a little bit scary. I think I'll stick to the shallows just a little while longer. Apartment Story is a difficult game to talk about without spoiling what makes it so special. It's an experience that takes roughly 2 hours to complete, and in that time, a lot happens. And also, paradoxically, not a lot. It's a game that distills the essence of living down into the space of a feature-length film, but also in that space makes paramount the fact that it is explicitly a game. I can't really talk about the things I truly adored about this experience. I really want you to find out for yourself, but what I can do is sow the seed of invitation in your mind about what those highlights might be. Observe this footage, the granularity of your actions, how fiddly the act of picking things up, using them, putting them down is, how many status meters you have to think about, how long it takes to do the things you need to keep your life together. Need to eat? Grab a plate, grab some food, assemble with care, sit down, eat. Want to tidy up? Painstakingly pick up each and every item one by one and manually place them somewhere neat. Even the simple act of grabbing a beer from the fridge for your friend is something you can embarrass yourself over. Now, imagine how that might relate to a more pressing need for action. Do you get what I mean? I don't think everything in Apartment Story necessarily works. Its writing I'm less enthusiastic about than its main mechanisms for delivering that story, and some of the narrative beats are very cliched. But in terms of an interactive experience, one that evokes a very specific feeling in the player, one that is incredibly immersive without breaking away from the need to also be cinematic, it's unbeatable. An evocative, thoughtful, tense, pulse-racing journey that culminates in the most panicked nightmare fuel of a final act I've played in years. £6 is all it takes to see for yourself. I'm a total sucker for games like these. Give me a small area to tootle about in, zero threats, loads of routes, an interesting diegetic story. Through the Fragmentation is a game that has what seems like a very straightforward set of goals. Break into this place, grab a computer disk, reach the drop-off point. But as it conspires, the routes to get to your goal also unspool out the other way too, leading to a branching path of fascinating experiences that have the potential to go in really wild directions. Part of the joy of games like these is that they are generously short. Some titles offer choice and branching paths with the intention of making a singular player experience feel unique, but they ask for a real investment to get to the conclusion of just one run. Sometimes dozens of hours, and often many of those hours end up being the same sequence of events. Bethesda games are notorious for this, scripted openings designed to onboard the player, brief in the moment but feeling agonizing to sit through on repeated runs. In Through the Fragmentation, that onboarding is done and dusted in a matter of minutes, and I managed 3 separate runs of the game in the space of a feature film. Part of why that was possible is that the game is designed with that im-sim grind set in mind. Once you know how to do something or where to go, you can do it earlier next time, and because the first half of the game is so zippy, you get to the game's more interesting branching elements with startling rapidness. And the game really is branching. On my first run, I accidentally caused the world to end, and that's not close to being the most bizarre thing you encounter in it. I can't really say much more without spoiling the surprise, so in more general terms, I really like the crisp frugality of the visuals. The character design is impeccably charming, it's a really striking art direction and a fascinating game world to be in, one that's set to be explored further in the upcoming, more ambitious follow-up, Fragmented City. I can't wait to discover more. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this format of video, I'm definitely up for making it into a series. I have a list of affordable, interesting looking games that's a mile long. There are always going to be works out there that will tickle some part of the imagination. It's often hard to find them amidst a sea of mediocrity. In the process of making this video, I did gamble on a few duds along the way, but the hit to miss ratio was still surprisingly high in my favour. That's the thing about a gut feeling. If you are interested in something, chances are you'll find a nugget of fascination within it regardless of your overall feelings about the work. Chances are, if you like the look of some of the games I've featured in this video, you'll probably get a kick out of playing them. All you need is some free time and a fiver, more or less. See you next time.